Russia's most serious military problem in 2026 is not the army positioned across the contact line. It is the army positioned on its own side of it. The soldiers who no longer believe in what they are being asked to die for. The men who are calculating the mathematics of survival before they have fired a single shot. The recruits arriving at training centers and immediately beginning to plan not how to fight, but how to surrender. Putin understood this problem was developing. He deployed every instrument available to a modern authoritarian state to suppress it. He multiplied contract signing bonuses fourfold. He imposed prison sentences of up to 16 years for desertion. He stationed Chechen barrier troops behind Russian lines with orders to shoot soldiers attempting to retreat. He recruited mercenaries from Nepal, Cuba, and across sub-Saharan Africa to fill the gaps that Russian volunteers were declining to fill. Each measure produced results for a period. Each measure subsequently collapsed, because money cannot purchase the will to fight from men who have decided the fight is not worth dying for. And fear cannot prevent surrender from men who have concluded that surrender is the rational option. What Putin produced instead of a solution was the largest organized military surrender movement in modern warfare. And Ukraine turned that collapse into a systematic intelligence and psychological operation that is now accelerating the very process it was designed to exploit. What follows is not a summary of individual desertions or prisoner counts. It is a structural analysis of why every tool Putin deployed to stop his army from dissolving made the dissolution faster, and what the historical pattern this sequence resembles tells us about where this is heading. If you want to understand the war beneath the frontline maps, this is where the real story is. The instrument Ukraine built to operationalize Russia's morale collapse is called I Want to Live. It is a state-run initiative offering guaranteed safe surrender through a Telegram chatbot, providing Russian soldiers with a direct channel to Ukrainian military handlers who coordinate the logistics of crossing the line without being shot by either side. More than 10,000 Russian soldiers have been processed through this system. The detail that most clearly illustrates the depth of the crisis is not the total number. It is the origin point of some of the applications. Surrender requests are arriving not from soldiers at the front line who have been broken by combat. They are arriving from training centers inside Russia, from men who have not yet deployed, who have assessed the available information and concluded that planning their surrender before seeing the front is the most rational use of their preparation time. The stories embedded in those numbers deserve individual attention because they reveal the different dimensions of a single systemic failure. Richard Akanuran, a Ugandan citizen recruited as part of Russia's foreign mercenary program, was sent to the front line without a coherent explanation of what he was fighting for or against. His account of his recruitment is worth absorbing in its own words. Someone approached him on the street, described available work in Russia, and the nature of that work was not clarified until he had already arrived. He surrendered at the first opportunity. His case is not exceptional, it is representative. More than 700 foreign nationals from approximately 40 countries have been captured by Ukrainian forces. Between 2 and 3 foreign mercenaries surrender per week on average. When soldiers recruited from across the world with promises of employment contracts drop their weapons at the first serious engagement, the message that reaches Russian soldiers watching them is not subtle. If the foreigners brought in specifically to supplement this army are running, the structural question of why we are still here becomes considerably harder to dismiss. Marina from Omsk represents a different dimension of the same crisis. Her husband signed a contract and deployed to the front. 3 months passed without communication. When she contacted the Ministry of Defense, the official response was that no information was available. She turned to social media, joining the expanding community of Russian military families searching for missing soldiers through unofficial channels rather than institutional ones. Marina's situation is not unusual. It has become a social pattern significant enough that in Samara, women gathered publicly and demanded Putin's removal from office. The families of missing soldiers have become a distributed engine of domestic discontent that no propaganda apparatus can fully neutralize, because the absence of a husband or son is not a narrative that can be managed with television coverage. The 30th Brigade desertion episode illustrates the organized rather than panicked character of what is occurring. 2,000 soldiers deserted in a single coordinated wave, representing more than half the brigade's strength. Court records indicate that the majority were soldiers whose contracts had expired, but who had been retained at the front without rotation through a legal mechanism that extended service obligations indefinitely during wartime. This was not a chaotic flight driven by battlefield panic. It was a collective, organized response to institutional betrayal by men who had fulfilled their contractual obligations and were being denied the right to leave. The legal and moral clarity of their position did not protect them from prosecution, but it did produce a category of desertion that carries a different social charge than abandonment under fire. The ethnic dimension of the casualty distribution adds a structural inequity to the morale crisis that compounds its political implications. Casualties are not flowing proportionally across Russia's geography. They are concentrating in Buryatia, Tuva, Dagestan, and other remote, economically marginal regions whose populations lack the political connections to avoid frontline assignment, and whose deaths generate less metropolitan attention than equivalent losses from Moscow or St. Petersburg. In prisoner exchanges, the prioritization pattern has been documented. Ethnic Russians are exchanged earlier. Soldiers from minority populations remain at the front longer. The 41st Army's command structure has been effectively destroyed through cumulative losses. At least 30 documented cases exist of soldiers executed for refusing combat orders. The common thread connecting all of these stories is the same. Money, punishment, and fear are not substitutes for the will to fight. They are instruments that function only as long as soldiers have not yet performed the rational calculation that the available evidence supports. Putin's most consequential own goal in the morale management campaign was the treatment of returned prisoners. Under the laws of armed conflict, prisoner exchanges occur periodically between belligerents. Between 2025 and 2026, more than 6,000 Russian soldiers were returned to Russia through formal exchange processes. The intended deterrent signal of punishing desertion and surrender required that these men be seen to suffer consequences for their capture. Russia's response was to route returned prisoners directly to penal battalions. At least 237 exchanged soldiers were immediately redeployed to the front line. The majority died or disappeared within weeks of their return. 4 were subsequently captured a second time by Ukrainian forces. Putin's intended message was clear. Surrender will be punished even after you return. The message that actually reached Russian soldiers at the front was the opposite of what was intended. If you surrender, get exchanged, and are immediately sent to a penal battalion where you will probably die, then the rational calculus of surrender has not been complicated. It has been clarified. Staying at the front means probable death. Returning to Russia through exchange means probable death. Surrendering to Ukraine means a chance of survival. Putin designed a deterrent and produced a rationalization. Ukrainian intelligence recognized this immediately and weaponized it, delivering the information about penal battalion treatment of returned prisoners directly to Russian frontline soldiers through the I Want to Live messaging system. Surrender, you will be safe. What awaits you at home is a penal battalion and a second deployment. The message was not propaganda. It was accurate, and Russian soldiers knew it was accurate because the information was coming from their own peers who had already been through the exchange cycle. The demographic profile of the prisoner population makes the picture more complete. Approximately 40% have prior criminal records. Around 38% were unemployed or economically marginal before recruitment. More than 80% are enlisted rank, men conscripted or contracted from Russia's most economically vulnerable communities. This is not an army of motivated ideological combatants. It is an army assembled from the population segments that had the fewest alternatives to military service, and that calculation of alternatives has now shifted. The front offers probable death. Prison offers survival. Surrender to Ukraine offers the best available odds. When this arithmetic becomes sufficiently clear to a sufficient number of soldiers, the behavioral consequences are not surprising. The 4 strategies Putin deployed sequentially to stop the bleeding deserve examination as a sequence, because the pattern of what happened after each one reveals something important about the structural nature of the problem. The contract bonus quadrupling initially attracted volunteers from the regions where the money represented genuine economic transformation. Then the death reports began reaching those same regions through social media channels that state media could not suppress, and the bonus lost its recruitment power. A secondary effect emerged that illustrated the institutional dysfunction operating beneath the surface. A growing number of men took the signing bonus and simply did not report to their units. The Kremlin found itself unable to deliver the soldiers it was paying for. The 16-year prison sentence for desertion produced a choice architecture that did not work as intended. A soldier at the front facing probable death in the near term is not deterred by the prospect of a prison sentence that requires surviving long enough to serve it. When the choice is between 16 years in prison and dying tomorrow, the majority choose prison. Desertion cases filed in 2026 exceeded 20,000. Each filing is a documented proof that the deterrent has failed in an individual case, and the aggregate of those failures represents a systemic collapse of the punishment mechanism. The Chechen barrier troops deployed to prevent retreat produced an outcome that in retrospect was predictable from basic behavioral economics. A soldier caught between the threat of being shot by barrier troops behind him and the threat of being killed by Ukrainian forces in front of him does not stop. He redirects. The rate of rearward flight decreased. The rate of forward surrender to Ukrainian positions increased. Fear did not eliminate the survival instinct. It redirected it toward Ukraine. The foreign soldier recruitment program sent its own unintended signal. Men from Nepal, Cuba, and multiple African countries, recruited under employment cover stories and deployed to combat positions without adequate preparation or language capability, surrendered at the first serious engagement at rates that were visible to Russian soldiers serving alongside them. The implicit message to those Russian soldiers was corrosive. If the men brought from 40 different countries specifically to supplement this army are discarding their weapons, the institutional confidence that the war is winnable has reached a level where even paid foreigners have rejected it. The structural equation underlying all of these individual stories has become Putin's central operational problem. Russia's own Security Council acknowledged a monthly contract signing rate of approximately 27,000 new soldiers. Independent analysis by German researcher Janis Kluver indicates that this rate is declining, with daily recruitment dropping from roughly 1,200 to between 800 and 1,000, a 20% reduction. The volunteer pool is contracting. In March 2026, Russian forces suffered 35,351 casualties, the highest single-month figure of the entire war, representing a daily average of approximately 1,140. Zelensky confirmed this figure personally. The Kyiv Post's calculation of the first quarter of 2026 is precise: 80,456 soldiers mobilized against 85,290 casualties, a deficit of approximately 4,800 soldiers, equivalent to 4 days of losses. Projections indicate this gap reaching 65,000 by year's end. The qualitative deterioration of the casualty picture compounds the quantitative imbalance. The Economist's May 2026 analysis documented a significant shift in the killed-to-wounded ratio, driven by Ukraine's drone capacity to strike medical evacuation vehicles. Wounded soldiers who cannot be evacuated die from wounds that would previously have been survivable. The tooth-to-tail balance has collapsed to the point where support personnel are being assigned combat roles. A leaked order from a Russian general confirmed that kitchen staff were being deployed as infantry. The operational consequences of this extend beyond the individual absurdity. When cooks are fighting, nobody is cooking. When nobody is cooking, morale drops further. When morale drops further, desertion accelerates. When desertion accelerates, the next attack becomes less coordinated, which increases casualties, which increases the pressure on the mobilization system, which increases the incentive to cut training time, which reduces the quality of replacement soldiers, which increases casualty rates again. The cycle is self-reinforcing, and there is no visible mechanism within the current Russian system for interrupting it. Every soldier who surrenders also transfers intelligence. Unit positions, commander identities, defensive vulnerabilities, supply route details. Ukrainian strike precision has increased by an estimated 30% over the past 2 years, and a significant portion of that improvement is attributable to the intelligence value of the prisoner flow. Each deserting soldier does not merely remove one person from the Russian order of battle. He makes the next Ukrainian strike more accurate, which produces more casualties, which produces more surrender applications, which produces more intelligence, which produces more accurate strikes. The historical pattern this sequence most closely resembles was identified by analysts studying the 1917 collapse of the Tsarist Russian army, and the parallel deserves careful examination rather than dismissal. The 1917 collapse moved through 5 documented stages: morale collapse, mass desertion, fraternization with enemy forces, frontline disintegration, and political revolution. In 2026, the first 3 stages are documented in verifiable open-source data. Morale collapse. At Stenishchi, the average mobilized Russian soldier survived approximately 12 minutes of combat. Units refused to advance. Surrender applications are arriving from training centers before deployment. Mass desertion. A report submitted to the UN Human Rights Council confirmed more than 50,000 desertions, representing approximately 10% fighting personnel, with projections exceeding 70,000 by year's end. Fraternization. The I Want to Live system represents coordinated prearranged surrender, with drone operators escorting soldiers across the line to Ukrainian positions at scheduled times. 3 soldiers surrendered by appointment in Kupiansk. This is not combat. It is coordination with the nominal enemy, the digital equivalent of soldiers shaking hands across the trenches in 1917. The 4th stage, frontline disintegration, has not yet materialized at scale. But in April 2026, Russia lost net territory for the first time since August 2024, approximately 46 square miles over 4 weeks. The spring offensive that was supposed to break the fortress belt collapsed with close to 100,000 casualties while losing ground rather than gaining it. The gap between the operational promises made to Putin by his commanders and the operational reality delivered to the front line has become too large to manage internally, which is why 17 generals have been dismissed in the past year without official explanation. The silence around those dismissals is itself an indicator of institutional stress. An organization that can explain its decisions does not suppress them. Russia retains genuine strengths that honest analysis cannot dismiss. A population of 145 million provides a demographic reservoir that has not been exhausted. The mobilization system, despite its documented problems, continues to function at some level. The financial incentives remain genuinely attractive to men from the country's poorest regions despite inflation. Russia's desertion tracking mechanism has some effectiveness. A portion of those who flee are located, returned, and prosecuted. And the structural problems afflicting Ukraine's military, the attrition of experienced personnel, the challenge of sustaining mobilization over a multi-year conflict should not be minimized in the interest of a clean narrative. But the structural difference between the two sides' problems lies in a single directional distinction. All of Russia's strengths operate on the input side of the equation: population, mobilization capacity, financial incentives. The output side, death, permanent injury, desertion, and surrender, is exceeding the input side and widening the gap every month. This is not a temporary imbalance that management adjustments can correct. It is a structural fracture in the system that produces soldiers. Dutch intelligence's April 2026 estimate placed permanent Russian casualties above 1.2 million, with confirmed deaths exceeding 500,000. Carnegie senior analyst Michael Kaufman's assessment is direct. The methods currently being deployed cannot produce an operational breakthrough. The commanders who promised Putin that Donbass would fall by autumn 2025 delivered 100,000 casualties and a contracting front line instead. The pattern of Putin's responses to the crisis, examined as a sequence, reveals the arc of an institutional failure rather than a series of independent policy mistakes. He offered money. Soldiers took the money and did not report. He imposed punishment. Soldiers chose prison over the front. He stationed troops behind his own lines. Soldiers surrendered forward instead of fleeing backward. He recruited foreigners. They dropped their weapons at the first engagement and confirmed to Russian soldiers that the institutional belief in the war's purpose had collapsed globally, not just domestically. He punished returned prisoners. The information spread through the front and made surrender the rational choice for anyone performing an honest cost-benefit analysis. Each solution worked briefly. Each collapsed because it addressed the symptom rather than the cause. The cause is that the will to fight cannot be purchased, coerced, or deceived into existence in men who have decided the war is not worth dying for. Russia crossed the threshold of that determination long ago, and the instruments available to a state that has lost the voluntary commitment of its fighting force are diminishing with each passing month. The true measure of a military's operational condition is not its equipment inventory, its territorial holdings, or the volume of its artillery fire. It is the answer to a single question that every soldier asks in some form: is this worth dying for? When that question is being answered in the negative by men planning their surrender from training centers before they have seen the front, the institutional reality of the Army's condition has been stated with more precision than any external analysis can provide. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of where Russia's military is actually breaking down beneath the frontline statistics, share it with someone still reading only the territorial maps. And if you want breakdowns that go into the structural mechanics of how this war is actually being decided, follow along. There is considerably more to unpack.